Hey guys, it's Belle, and in this video we are going to be reading through some texts by my favorite author of all Latin poetry. He's just so much fun, Eugenius of Toledo, and these are what I am tentatively calling his Visigothic proverbs for reasons that we'll get into. Now, these are 17 proverbs that are found within his Little Book of Songs, and I'm going to be doing lots of videos about the Little Book of Songs because, among other things, it's the earliest evidence I have found for a gay long-distance relationship, so that's really fun. And he's just a really charismatic poet. He's camp, he's over the top, he's very down to earth in some ways. And these proverbs are part of the book of songs that he was writing at the end of his life, and there are many songs in the book which indeed talk about being at the end of life and being in old age. Now, it's difficult to find good pictures of the manuscript online, but this book of songs, as I'll get into in future videos, is really, really influential in the Visigothic period. Its poetry provided the basis for many other poems. It was recycled in various ways. We have many different manuscript witnesses. It just so happens that this is basically the only one I could find online, but you can see here it's marked in the manuscript with proverbium there, and then we start with the first one, frigidus in bellis, and then it goes on and on. Aliut, aliut, aliter. It goes down and down and down like that. So we've got a bunch of different proverbs all marked out like that. And I'm going to give these texts to you. I'll read them out in their Latin original and in a modern Gothic translation that I have made, because my personal suspicion is that these are quotes which were Visigothic in their origin rather perhaps than Roman or Latin in their origin, as we'll see. And part of the reason I believe that these are Visigothic proverbs which Eugenius of Toledo didn't just make up himself is that we see them referenced in other Visigothic Latin texts. So we have a Visigothic treatise of grammar called the Ars Grammaticae, which has historically been attributed to Julian of Toledo, and it repeats one of Eugenius's proverbs in Book 2, where it says, Metrum troceictum tetrametrum, quales pedes recipit superiores, da eos exemplum, qui canem caudare tentat. So these are basically lines from a class on grammar, which, by the way, I should do a video on that text as well, the Ars Grammaticae, because it's so cute. You just sort of have a text that is the script for a teacher and a student in a grammar class, and it's so adorable. So the teacher asks, or says, the trochaic tetrameter style of poetry, quales pedes recipit? How many feet does it have? Superiores, like a greater number. And then the teacher asks his students, da eos exemplum, give an example of this. And the student responds, qui canem caudare tentat. And now those last four words, qui canem caudare tentat, as we'll see, are from Eugenius of Toledo's Proverbs. And also in the Dicta Sancti Valeri de Genere Monachorum, we have one of these proverbs cited just as if it's common knowledge, basically. Recte namque censetur ut cum quo participat errorem aeternam retributionis cum eo sortiatur ultionem. Quia ipse iubere nefas ille perdibertur amare, qui prohibere valet, nec prohibere valet. So, what this is saying here is in Saint Valerius's sayings about the kinds of monks. This Saint Valerius says, "Recte namque censetur." Truly, it is, I guess, censored or judged. Ut cumquo participat errorem. With whom somebody shall participate in sin or in error, aeterna reputationis cum eo sortiatur solutionem. He shall be judged to the same eternal retribution with him. Quia ipse iubere nefas, ipse perdibetur amare. And then it goes into, obviously that's Eugenius's proverb right there, as we'll see later on. So it's basically saying that, if you are an accomplice to crime, you are as guilty of that crime. And the reason why is we all know the saying. And then Valerius quotes Eugenius's proverb. Now, there are a few different possible interpretations. It's possible that because Eugenius of Toledo's proverbs, and as part of the book of poetry, were very widespread in the Visigothic period, it's possible that these other monks had read Eugenius's poetry and therefore started repeating it themselves, or these poems just became very popular and people forget sometimes, or forgot that some of them had come from Eugenius of Toledo, so they forgot to attribute it to Eugenius. Or it's possible that these proverbs are Visigothic cultural sayings which Eugenius had heard around him in his youth, and he was transposing them into Latin poetry. And this is part of the reason why I have translated them into the Gothic language, because I believe that they may have originally been sayings that were spoken in the Gothic language. That's just a theory of mine. I don't have massive proof for it. But either way, whether they were originally invented by Eugenius and later became popular among the Visigoths, or whether they were popular among the Visigoths and Eugenius codified them, I still think it's justified to call them Visigothic proverbs. And they give us a lot of insight into Visigothic culture and the worldview. So let's just get into it. So with these, first I'll read out the original Latin, and then I will read you the Gothic, and I will translate both of them. And with all of these, I've got a little image on the side which is from Visigothic or Ostrogothic art, which will give you some kind of connection to the text itself. So this one: Frigidus in bellis frustra precingitur armis, nil valet exterius defit ubi propria virtus. And then the Gothic reads: Calds in drochti vittoda suare weipnam bigerdada, nis werth fata faru thari macht sina werthith uscrudio. So, what does all of this mean? It means, now literally, I'm going to give you a literal translation, and my Gothic translation is quite literal. It says, Frigidus, a cold man, in bellis frustra precingitur armis, is, there's no, basically, he's armoured with weapons and with armour. In warfare, in bellis, frustra, in vain, there's no point to it, because nil valet exterius, his exterior is worth nothing, defit ubi propria virtus, when his own virtue or like manliness is another translation of the word virtus. So the reason that this is a bit weird is because it doesn't make sense, right? Especially to a modern reader. We're like, what does being cold have to do with being manly? Now, this relates to Greco-Roman concepts and ideas of manliness and masculinity. So, to the Greco-Roman understanding of bodily humours, and this kind of knowledge is synthesized, among others, by Isidore of Seville in his etymologies, which, by the way, the Visigoths obviously had access to. Isidore of Seville's etymologies. He says how heat is more associated with men as they come into the prime of their age and into adulthood, and it sort of has not yet developed in boyhood, and it has faded away in old age. So this is clearly some kind of reference to the presence of testosterone in the male body. This heat that is referred to in these medical texts. The Venerable Bede also gives a good summary of this kind of understanding of how the body, the male body, goes from being cold, hot, and blah, 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 in chapter 35 of his book, De Temporum Ratione, on the reckoning of times. And if you want me to dive into those texts more, feel free to leave a comment and I will do my best to get around to them. So the point being that this cold therefore associates a man who is cold. It's implied either that he actually is in one of those stages of life in which an author contemporary to the Visigoths, such as Isidore of Seville, would have been saying he was cold. So Isidore of Seville would have said a boy is cold and an old man is cold. So any man who is cold, it may be because he is literally physically immature or old, or because in his actions it implies a sort of inner character which can only come about as a result of having this kind of humoric balance. So this, to some degree, implies a sort of weakness which can be linked discursively to effeminacy and a wetness and a lack of control over one's bodily humours. And for that reason, there is no point armouring such a man with weapons in warfare, because his exterior is worth nothing if his manliness is lacking. This manliness is the heat, which obviously a cold man is lacking, and that heat seems probably to come from testosterone. And as somebody who who's a male person who obviously was once testosterone dominant and has been on estrogen, I can confirm that having lower testosterone does in fact make you quite cold. It makes you feel the cold quite a bit more, and vice versa, where having more testosterone in your bloodstream warms you up a good deal. So they weren't completely wrong in some of these things. There is a connection between the physical appearance of manhood and hot and cold temperatures. So there you go. This sort of implies like a sissy man is vainly girded with armor in war because his exterior is worth nothing if his virtue, and virtus can also mean manliness, if his virtue or his manliness is lacking. So there we go. I love to bring up this proverb because it is a really good example of why you need to look at the original language to understand, to see all of the sexual connotations that are underlying Eugenius of Toledo's work, because a translator would just say a cold man, and we don't get enough out of that translation. We need to know more, and I'm trying to tell you that all of those extra things in this video. Let's go on. So, this is the one which was referenced in the grammatical treatise. In Saint Valerius's sayings that I mentioned at the very start of this video. So this is the second proverb. Ille jubere nefas, ille peribetur amare, qui prohibere valet, nec prohibere volet. Now, the Gothic reads, Sa anabiuran unerkna, tho frion witwadiada, sai warian mag, nich warian willi. So what this means is, that man is said, peribetur, ubere nefas, to order wicked things. Nefas is one of my favourite Latin words. Nefas, it's wicked or evil things. Ille peribetur amare, he is said to love wicked things. Qui prohibere valet, nec prohibere volet, who is able to prohibit wicked things from happening. Nec prohibere volet, nor wants to prevent these things. So this is almost an echo of that saying that we have today. It's a quote by a historian, but I can't quite remember who it is, which says that all it takes for evil to happen is for a good man to do nothing. If you remember who said that, please let me know in the comments. So, on to the next one, and we have some more juicy sexuality stuff here for me to disentangle. So, Conjugiis et nati vitia vix nosse valemus, quodque domi gerditur postremi scire solemus. And then the Gothic reads, Vinons quennes vitan, jachca bordanes hallis magum, fati garda worciada spedisse vitum. Now what this means is, vis nosse valemus, we are hardly able to know vitia conjugis et nati, the vices of a wife and of a child. Quodque domi gerditur, and that which is done at home, postremi scire solemus, we are usually the last to know. Now, this can actually be taken a couple of different ways depending on the perspective one sees in this. And the fact, by the way, that some of these proverbs, such as the first one, pertain to warfare is what suggests to me, among other things, that these are originally cultural sayings of the Visigoths that Eugenius of Toledo, who, bear in mind, is a bishop and a monk, he is compiling these and translating them into Latin poetry because, monks are not going to be going to war. It doesn't make sense for a bunch of monastic proverbs to give advice on warfare, but here we are. And likewise, we have advice about, like, wives and children. But this could be read in one of two ways. The vitia conjugis et nati, the vices of a wife and child, could refer to the vice of inhabiting the sexual role, so the sexually passive role of a wife, or unfortunately a child, because children are sort of, because of their vulnerability, perceived as very viable targets for sexual penetration in this period. It's grim, but it's what they write, and so the vitia could refer to that, or it could refer to the vice of having a wife, or unfortunately, again, a child to sexually penetrate. And that depends on how one reads it. If one reads this proverb as a secular proverb by like masculine Visigothic, usually heterosexual, or at least in some kind of heterosexually reproductive household, men describing their own values, then it's probably interpreted in the sense of the vices are the vices of being in that position. But if we read this valemus, like we are barely able to know, this would mean that it's the monks, it could mean, I should say, it's the monks who are barely able to know the vices of a wife and child because they don't get married or have children. So it's possible that this is the case. And this last bit, quodque domigeritur postremi scire solemus, and that which is done at home we are usually the last to know about it. This reflects a sort of division between domestic work, which is sort of feminine, and extra domestic work, which is largely seen as more masculine, and feminist theorists have noted this trend for a very long time, notably Val Plumwood in her, I think, 1997 paper on feminist dualism, which is a very interesting read if anyone should want to. So there we go. There is the third proverb about how either monks don't get married and have children, or real manly Visigothic men have no idea what it's like to be a wife or a child being penetrated. So interesting stuff here. And we have another one here, and this is another verse which confirms that, I guess, equivocation between wives, children, and also slaves, which is partly where the sort of submission inherent in the mores of sexual penetration to a Greco-Roman cultural understanding come into our reading of the text. So we have here, cum conjux natus vel servus peccat alumnus, cantica vulgus habet, nos tamen ista latent. And the Gothic reads, Fanquains gaborthans ethos skalks fra workith fodits, liutha malari habeth, aki unsisto galiugniond. So, what does all of this mean? Right. Cum conjux natus vel servus peccat alumnus. So all of these are roughly, it's equating them, because we have three nominatives, conjux, natus, servus. These are three nouns, but only one singular verb, which is peccat. So it's equating them, either a wife or a child or a slave. And these two, the child and the slave, they have an adjective alumnus, which sort of means fed or nourished. And I go into much more detail on this in my video entitled The Sexual Politics of Bread in Visigothic Spain, but this basically refers to a almost sugar daddy relationship where the male head of households, the garda waldans, to use the Gothic word for it, or the gahleva, would go out and get bread, bring it home, and feed his family on that bread, and he was sort of dominant both sexually and economically over this family. And this verb peccat, so to sin, this in certain Latin contexts means to engage in the wrong kind of sex, so in this case passive sexual activity, so penetration. Cantica vulgus habet. The commoners have songs about this, and singing songs about people who, and particularly men, engaging in non-permissible sexual activities such as bottoming is a common theme in Eugenius's works, as we will see in a later video I am going to do about the scandal that occurred earlier on in his life, in which he was accused of homosexuality, and Eugenius lamentingly describes how people sung cruel songs about him because he got too close to a male friend. Really, really interesting use of language here by Eugenius of Toledo. So the commoners get songs about the wife, the child, or the serf, having passive sex. But nos tamen ista latent. But these songs are silent about us. So this is saying that we are not mentioned in these songs because we don't do that kind of sex. And among other things, these are my sort of personal headcanon reading of all of this, is that these are proverbs which Eugenius of Toledo might have been scolded with sometimes by his masculine warlord father Evancius, and therefore in his old age he remembers them quite well and committed them to writing. So there we go. So Eugenius is almost distancing himself from the passive sexual activity of which he has been, it is implied, accused in recording these proverbs and using the inclusive we. These songs are silent about us, we barely know the vices of a wife and kid, etc., etc. Even though in some of his other poetry he implies that he might have been a bit of a bottom himself. Among other things, in his poem about the advent of my own old age, he says, and this is my favorite line of all by him. He says, "Corrupi proprium lascivo vulnere corpus," which is a complicated Latin euphemism. Basically, a literal translation would read, "I defiled my own body via a slutty wound." And if you compare it with a reading of Ausonius's poetry, which uses the term vulnus to refer to the male anus when sexually penetrated, or just when penetrated, perhaps a reference, of course, to anal fissures and bleeding, which is a bit maybe TMI, but in that line, we can translate that perhaps somewhat crudely as Eugenius of Toledo saying, "I fingered my own arse." So amazing, 10 out of 10. We are here for our bottoming king, Eugenius of Toledo, and let us go on to the gay bread poem, as some of my friends in the modern Gothic revival have been calling it. Misinterpreting it perhaps, but nonetheless, let's go on. I've gone into this in more detail in my video on the sexual politics of bread in Visigothic Spain, so I won't rehash that too much here, but let's get into it. So, pane suo vivens, alienio negotia supplens, iste sanus eger est. So, and the Gothic reads, "Leva cinema libans, frama theatoia in medians, saga hella ist sioux." So what this means is, vivens pane suo, a man living on his own bread, aliena negotia supplens, but still exchanging strange deeds, strange dealings, iste sanus eger est. This physically healthy man is mentally ill or sick, eger est. So this is, of course, referring to the sort of image of the galeva in Visigothic culture, which is a sort of man who is masculine and capable. He's able to go out and fight with his fellows and get bread, literally bring it home, and use that bread to feed his family, whom he is able to therefore be sexually dominant over. So the implication of a man living on his own bread is a man who is, capable enough physically to provide for himself, but is nonetheless engaging in alieno negotia, like he's engaging in strange dealings, with the implication of some of those being unusual sexual activity. We see similar uses of aliena negotia in some of Luxurius's poetry, which is more explicitly describing passive homosexual sexual activities. So, the implication then in some of these is that a man who is able to financially support himself, still bottoming basically, despite being physically healthy, sanus, he is mentally ill, because in Visigothic law codes, homosexuality is described as an illness, as a mental illness. So that trope, unfortunately, is still with us after many, many centuries, at least in certain corners of Western society. But there you go. On to this next one, which is just a bit more humorous, and many of these are just quite funny, in my opinion. So, "Cardus et spinna cum passum preparasello, lactuca labris compar est." So, when the Gothic, I should say, reads, "Than vigadina iach thornus mat asilo fragibith, lactuca veridum is calici." So, when a thistle and sort of thorn give pasture or food to a donkey, like we have here, its lips are become like lettuce. So it's saying that when donkeys are eating thorns, their lips swell up and they get cut up and they look like lettuce. So a bit of a humorous one here. And this one also is IMO quite humorous. I have a video diving into this proverb in a lot more detail, so I'm going to relatively gloss over it. But this video is a Visigothic pluck and proverb if you want to look it up. So let's go. Ipse manus sibimet in mundo stercare fedat, qui canem caudare tentat. He soils his hands with unclean shit who holds his dog by the tail, and the Gothic is sa skita un renia ma handun sis bisolith, sa hun sterta fasteth. And part of the reason I did that video is because I believe that this plaque here, this Visigothic plaque, is depicting the sort of events described in this poem, and that helps us make sense of what we're seeing in the image. That's just my personal view. It's not been written about elsewhere in scholarship, but just so you're aware of my personal headcanon about that. So let's go on to this one, which is basically a fun little threat. So, escafies canibus fueris y furfre mixtus, mats hundam muertes jave fnastel landeso. So, you would become food for the dogs if you were mixed with barley, or depending on how you translate the Latin, if you get mixed up in theft. So the Visigoths did not fuck around, they kept guard dogs, it seems. So this is another little bit of wisdom actually. Detrahit adversus famam componit amicus. Fians merita minsnith, frions thoga timrith. Which means and your enemy will bring down your reputation and your friend will build it back up again, which I think is pretty cute and quite wise. Somebody in the Gothic revival described these, therefore, as almost like a Visigothic Hofmor, and I don't agree with that comparison. It's obviously like quite different, but you do get some bit of like life wisdom in these proverbs, let's say, along with the humor and along with the sexual allusions. And this is another one of those jokes, but it gives us some insight into Visigothic cultural values. So, si barbe sanctum faciunt nil sanctio circo. And then the Gothic would read, Jave vardos wichan adoyand nist wecht wichis orthoget. So what this means is, if beards make a man holy, there is nothing holier than a billy goat. So this is an interesting little thing that tells us that the Visigoths considered beards to be a sign of holiness, which is more of an Eastern Orthodox kind of thing than a Western Catholic thing, but there we go. Ooh, we're on to another one which gives us some more insight into sexual mores in Visigothic times, so let's go. Femina noctura servorum crimina fingit, and then quinno sois proto galiugeth, veve vins scalce litith. So what the Latin means is femina noctura. Femina, of course, is woman, and then noctura is about to be married. Servorum crimina, the crimes of slaves, fingit, she imitates. Now, based on these proverbs that we looked at earlier, where we see the vitia conjugas et nati, the vices of a wife and child, and we see the sin here of a slave, the way that a slave sins or is implied to sin. We can guess from some of these then, from these subtle implications, that the crimes of slaves refer to passive sexual activity, but then specifically to anal penetration, because these are male slaves, servorum fingit. So she imitates the crimes of male slaves, and my sort of reading of this is that the woman about to be married might want to maintain her hymen intact, and therefore does anal sex with the groom or anyone else instead of vaginal sex to avoid that risk. So a bit much, but there we go. And the fact that this is that all Eugenius of Toledo has to do is use this dog whistle, and he understands that Visigoths are going to get what it means, because otherwise this doesn't make sense, right? A woman about to be married imitates the crimes of slaves. Like, it doesn't really make sense unless you bear in mind that more sexual interpretation of it. And so the fact that Eugenius of Toledo is able to just say this and dog whistle to it and imply what's going on means that it must have been fairly common for men to sexually penetrate their male slaves in Visigothic Spain, as we saw in the previous proverbs, as we saw implied, I should say, in the previous proverbs. So, on to proverb number 12. verba perdit et salivam ponderoso incangitans. Wardam fraquisti theax spesculdra cordiama wardi ucans, I should say. So what this means is a man in concitans arguing ponderoso with a fatty, with a heavy man, verba perdit et salivam. He wastes his words and his spit. So there you go, I suppose. This is a very quick one, but it's quite poignant and echoes some Latin proverbs that we know of as well. Tortus erit animo fuerit qui corpore tortus. Rex sevole ist sai requa lica est. So he is twisted, tortus, in his soul, fuerit qui corpore tortus, who is twisted in his body. So this is, of course, like the Latin saying, mens sana in corpore sano. And this one is quite similar to some proverbs that we have today. Sat melior viva in scatola quam functa leanea. And ganach baptizo livandi catilo for levo dotha, which means a living kitty is better than a dead lioness. And this, of course, sounds a lot like our modern proverb, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Mendaces faciunt ut verum falsa putemus, liugnans doyant is suniga liuga domiema. That is proverb number 15, and it says, liars make it so that we think true things are false. So this is, I guess, lamenting how the fact that people lie makes us distrustful of our neighbors. On to proverb number 16, another one about lies. Mendax est promissa negans aut rere tardans. Liugnia ist gaheta varians ethotho usgevan latians. A liar is a man who is refusing to give things that he promised or delaying in returning them. And then on to the very last one, which is also to some degree about lying and deception, which is duplex nec bello fortis nec pace fidelis. Twifalt nec iuce machtis nec gavertia tringus. Which means two-faced is a man who is neither strong in battle nor loyal or faithful during peacetime. So there we go. And this is yet another proverb about warfare, suggesting that these proverbs are not, in fact, the kinds of proverbs that monks were sharing among themselves, but were rather Visigothic proverbs that Eugenius of Toledo is recording for posterity. So there we go, that's the end of it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want me to teach you Gothic or Latin or any of the other languages that I do here on this channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which will be linked in the description of this video. You can also join my Discord server where we sometimes do language learning activities. And if you have questions about Eugenius's poetry, feel free to ask them because I'm definitely preparing more videos about him. And with that being the case, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye everyone!